Here from the depths of the Nordic winter night comes the Sorcerer diagram discussion continued. And I'm just going to jump straight in using a slightly unusual set of source material. This dates back to a Gen Con a few years ago where I finally hit upon a way to use Sorcerer for a convention demonstration. And anyways, all I really have to say is that I had a number of personal templates and a number of lore-based and demon templates, and players could just kind of grab them and put two together and click and lock, as we say. And one of the main things that it provided was a few items for kicker, cover, price, and lore, but very few. And the player was supposed to put them together and was supposed to come up with a few more things that kind of fit their notion of the character and created sort of an ownership over that, and gave a few more items. So I said, you need about 8 to 10, items total. You got about 4 maybe from the write-up. So anyways, it's perfectly suited to this. So I actually did this by rolling dice, right? I said, well, which character, which person and which lore set, and I put those together. Now, another thing about this particular demo, which is not the case typically for play, is that there was a single shared kicker. All of these were sort of efficiency devices for the convention. I had tried to come up with many such devices over the years for Sorcerer, and they don't work. This one actually kind of did. So anyway, I have here, therefore, the starting diagram, which is really just a list of the items because they're not placed. They're just in the right sectors. And this first one is for the character Reverend Keenan James. You should know that this particular scenario involves a rundown city church. And by church, I mean a fairly extensive block-sized grounds, right? So there's multiple buildings and courtyards and stuff like that. And it's, in tottering, hardly functional at all as a church. Probably a number of parts of it have been sort of co-opted, rented out, and used by God knows what, fly-by-night construction companies or whatever. And the nature of it as a church is, pretty much a thing of the past. But Reverend Keenan James is still there, one of the characters. And let's take a look. Which one am I got right there? This one. Okay. So of the items, the ones that were provided by the material for Keenan James and the material for the lore plus demon that I grabbed or rolled for would be as follows. Associated with the price are some old political files, still in the file cabinet in his office. And the important thing about those is it sort of goes with his price, which is that he's kind of run down and personally scarred, not physically, but his days of being the activist reverend are long past. And this is sort of the last remnant of it all. And so that price gives him penalties in certain situations. So then what else from the sheet? Comes his contact in the city council. So there's some councilman, maybe also, back in the day, but this is more of what he does now. It's in the cover category. This is what he presents as and things that are important to him in that function. So that relationship with the city councilman may be one of the reasons why this thing is even still around. And then we also have his congregation. So there are actually people who attend. You can just imagine, the remnants and occasionals and basically, needy folk in the region and stuff like that who sort of show up there and can be considered a congregation. From the lore that I drew, somewhat squickly, all these demons were also fairly unified. They all had the same need, that the binding person has to practice observance of a religious sort. And this one was a creepily neglected looking child, a passing demon. And also, interestingly enough, that isn't responded to normally or as you would expect by anyone. So, it's not like any passerby or anyone cares that there's this, disturbingly, somewhat not quite right looking, neglected looking, child there. And I'm fond of this demon because it's a badass, grows into a giantess and, smashes things. And anyway, it's quite fun in action and play. But for our purposes, that lore sheet provided also that this would be a coven member. This is the first time, actually, in the times that I've used this material, that I ever have seen Keenan James and this particular lore put together. So it's to have him be a coven member as a sorcerer and also the reverend of the church with a congregation typically isn't the case. I mean, it's not unlikely statistically, but it's the first time I've seen it. But that's really kind of a tight thing. The telltale for the particular lore set is that there is a cross, a Christian cross that's engaged with it, but it's got a strange alteration. It's clearly a modified cross of some kind. And so now with those, I say, well, what else can I do now? I'm a player now. I'm going to put these two things together and I'm going to make up a few more items. And so what I add, I'm thinking about the cover thing, and I was thinking about the extent of the church and the grounds of, okay, there's an annex that actually has some living quarters, which is where the Reverend lives. Or if, like, maybe in days past, the Reverend had a nice house somewhere and the annex was for, a live on site caretaker or something. But now it's where Keenan James lives. So I wrote annex there for, where he lives. It's it's right there in the church area. And I decided for all of these that I would not have church as an item. It's too big. I mean, it's too, what's the word I want? It's context for everything else, especially because they all have this shared kicker, which is that the church is just been slated to be closed down. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. What else did I stick on here? I decided that since he is the reverend of the congregation and he's also in the coven, a sorcerer's coven, those are not the same things, that the somewhere in the church, that he has can make access to quite easily, perhaps in his office or a room. I was actually thinking like a utility closet. That's where he's got all the coven stuff, the things that the coven uses for their activities. So that's in there. I say there's a closet, the coven closet, if you will. And I was looking around and I realized that for him, for everybody's kicker, there's going to be this sign that was just put up in front of the church, promising the wonderful new stuff that's going to be there soon. And for him, I said, this could use a couple more items. I mean, he's going to have a letter from the city that, tells him this is going to happen. And I got to thinking, there's not very many people on here. Should I make up a coven member and whatever? And then I said, aha, I know a person, that I would like in this is some flack from the city council or the city government, some, fairly optimistic, professional whose job is to sort of make sure that this happens. And of course, he's going to be all about, what a friend he is to everybody in doing this act of urban renewal and hope and growth. So I'm going to call them the flack at this point. So, okay, those, I've got them. If you look at the picture, they are all in the right sector. They're all up against the outer border, and you need to understand that they're, in most cases, their connection to each other, their ordering either sideways or up or down within each sector doesn't mean anything. Are there any exceptions to that? The letter and the flak would seem probably to, have something to do with each other. And the sign, you could see how, they might sort of hook up a little bit rather than just be sitting there separately down there. Same thing goes probably for the cross he's wearing and the demon. It doesn't necessarily mean that where the cross goes, the demon goes, but we'll see. We'll see. I'm looking at those and saying, are any of those necessarily hooked up? Well, anyway, looking at that, now we say, how do things move? And the first thing I have to tell you is that no item on this diagram is motile. It can't move by itself. It has no intrinsic feature that moves it anywhere. So the logic of, wow, so the sign's obviously really important, so it's going to move to the middle. Now what goes there too? No. The sign does not, it's not a motorboat. It doesn't go to the middle for any reason whatsoever. It's remarkable how quickly, in looking at this diagram and saying, well, the middle's the important place. All right, so what looks important? Okay, it's got to go there. And you have to lose that. The first things first, okay, so what moves to the middle? And the answer is nothing. They can't move. So with that in mind, all of a sudden, all the urge to suddenly start shifting things to the middle just needs to go away. You don't say, well, this would be important or this would do that thing, so it's going to go to the middle now. That's prep logic from 1,000 other games, but it's not the logic here. What is the logic here? Well, you'll start to see it. I have 2 steps now. They'll start to see it when I start looking at adjacent sectors and seeing what things pull toward each other. And in this case, it's not only 2 of them, but it's nicely symmetrical, so it's really easy to teach with. And since the coven is a subset of the congregation, they hook up. They need to be next to each other because one is an aspect of the other. So, therefore, physically, part of the congregation is the coven. See, we're going by physicality, if at all possible. And if not physicality, then very definite and fairly static relationships of what things are. You can't say, well, why look, Joe Bob and Luann, what if they fall in love? And then on the sheet, the 2 things look at each other and they run into each other's arms and the 2 things shift across. No, we're not talking about what they do in play or what they're going to do in play or anything like that. We're talking about what they are as conceived by the player. You could say to the player, do Luann and Joe Bob know each other? And the player's like, no. And you're like, okay. You can't talk about, wow, you as the GM are going to have them spot each other from afar and then I'm going to stick them together on the sheet. That's going to be my prep for having that happen in play. That's exactly not what we're doing here. The coven, physically, incontrovertibly, is a subset of the congregation. Let's pull them together. And when that happens, you say, okay, so they pull together and move to the middle. That is the other conceptual thing to abandon. The notion that the middle itself exerts a gravitational pull so that anything you're moving toward one another also moves to the middle just because it has this pull on anything that's mobile. That is not the case. The center does not pull. So they have nowhere to go except to that corner. That's where they're going to go. Because there's nothing pulling them toward the middle. There's nothing in them going to the middle. And because they don't have that capacity either. And they end up in the corner. So you can see the covenant and the congregation. Now, I can't help but think of the coven closet and the demon and the cross all as having this physical association with the coven. It doesn't, again, like I said, it doesn't mean that when one goes somewhere, the other has to go. But They are members of each other, just like the coven is a subset of the congregation. The closet is a conceptual subset of the coven. So they trail after. Now, they are not associated with the congregation as such. Therefore, they don't move to that line like the coven did. They trail after the coven. It's like they're little choo-choo train things behind it, and they just kind of go with it. So there they are, trailing behind. Now, something similar happens when I'm looking at the characters in Coven and in the Kicker, and I hadn't really thought about this regarding the Flak when I made them up, but now I look and I say, oh, well, the Councilman and the Flak are institutionally associated with one another. If the Councilman does something that's relevant to the Flak's going to have to cope. If the Flak is doing something and it's either, the Councilman's either on a committee or something, or would make it his business to be on, to be aware of this, I can see an institutional relationship with them. They belong to the same thing. So it's not like the Flak rides on the Councilman's back. So he's not, a part of the Councilman the way the coven is a part of the congregation. But there's an institutional connection there that given the nature of the game, and perhaps if we were thinking about the two statements of the game, we would go, oh, okay, those two things are part of a piece of a power structure, and this is in a great part about social power structures. So okay, we find that the Councilman heads down to the corner, and notice that neither the congregation going up nor the Councilman going down takes the annex with them. The annex has nothing to do with the consecrate. The congregation does not, include the Reverend's living quarters, and the Councilman has nothing to do with that either. There's no physical or social, hookup there. So that's left where it is. So anyway, the Councilman goes down there, and the Flak travels over to the same corner for exactly the same reason as the upper one did. And again, just like the upper one, these things are going to trail after. The Flak is the personification, if you will, of the letter, and the letter and their institutional activity is why there's a sign in front of the church. So they just trail after, right? So there you go. We're looking at this, and I'm saying, okay, this is a good demonstration of those two principles, that intrinsically no one item goes put on its own toward the center, nor when things move is there a separate toward each other, that there is no separate force that says, oh, well, you're moving, come on over here. That doesn't happen either.